There is a village called Hannam, a few miles east of Bristol, where the land was once honeycombed with coal pits, and the air smelled of smoke and metal. It was a working place, a hard place, the kind of place where children went into the mines before they were old enough to understand what a mine was. This is where John Horwood was born in 1803. He was the fifth son of Thomas and Phoebe Horwood. There were 10 children in all, 6 boys and 4 girls. They were not prosperous. They were not connected. They had no standing in the world beyond the standing of any family that worked hard and stayed out of serious trouble. John Horwood would not manage even that. He would become, in the span of 18 years, the subject of a sensational criminal trial, a public execution, a post-mortem dissection conducted as theatre, and finally a book. A book bound in his own skin. This is his story, or at least the story that has survived him, which, as we will see, was shaped by forces that did not have his interests at heart. John Horwood went to work in the mines as a small child. This was not unusual for the time and place. The Mines Act, which would eventually set a minimum age of 10 for children working underground, did not yet exist. Children were sent into the pits because they were small enough to fit where adults could not, because their labour was cheap, because it had always been done that way. John worked in local collieries around Hannam from an early age, but the mines were dangerous places. Catastrophically, horrifyingly dangerous. During his time working underground, John Horwood witnessed a series of accidents, and in one of them, one of his brothers was killed. 3 other workers died alongside him. John refused to go back. You cannot blame him for that. A child who has watched his brother die in the dark underground does not owe the pit anything further. He went to work instead with his father at a local spelter works. Most likely the Hannam Spelter Works, where zinc alloy was processed. Another hard industrial job, but above ground. He worked there for a time, and then in 1819, when John was 16 years old, he was let go. The reason given was bad behaviour, mischief, vandalism. Around Hannam, John Horwood was known as a troublesome boy, a prankster, someone who caused minor havoc for his neighbours. The accounts that have survived paint him as restless, disruptive, difficult to manage. A boy with too much energy and not enough direction, which is a description that has applied to many thousands of 16-year-olds throughout history, most of whom did not end up on the gallows. But John Horwood's story was already moving towards something darker. Her name was Eliza Balsum. Some accounts spell it Balsum. She was older than John, though not by much. At some point, the two of them had been in a relationship of some kind. The exact nature of it is difficult to reconstruct from the sources that survive, which were not written by either of them, and which reflect the perspectives of people who would later testify against John in court. What is clear is that by the end of 1820, the relationship was over. Eliza had ended it. She had moved on, she had a new companion, a young man named William Waddy, and John Horwood had not accepted this gracefully. He had made threats. He had said, according to witnesses, that he would mash her bones to pieces if he ever saw her with another man. Whether he meant this literally, whether it was the kind of hot-headed thing that young men said in anger and did not act upon, or whether it was a genuine statement of violent intent, is something we cannot now determine with certainty. What we know is that on a day in late January of 1821, John Horwood saw Eliza Balsum with William Waddy. They were crossing a stream on the outskirts of the village, using stepping stones, laughing and talking as they went, and John Horwood, watching from the other bank, picked up a stone and threw it. The stone struck Eliza on the right temple. She was helped back to her mother's house, conscious but in obvious pain. The initial injury appeared, by contemporary accounts, to be relatively minor. A blow to the head, yes. A wound at the temple, but she was conscious. She was walking. She was not, as far as anyone could immediately tell, dying. For several days, Eliza was treated at home. Then she began walking to the Bristol Royal Infirmary as an outpatient. The distance from Hanham to the infirmary is roughly 5 miles. She was walking 10 miles a day to be treated and to return home. This tells us something about either her resilience or the limited options available to her. Probably both. On the 31st of January 1821, a surgeon at the Bristol Royal Infirmary noticed Eliza in the waiting room. His name was Dr. Richard Smith. He was the senior surgeon at the infirmary. He observed what he described as a depressed fracture at the right temple. He insisted that she be admitted immediately. And here is where the story becomes considerably more complicated, because from this point forward, the fate of Eliza Balsum was in the hands of Dr. Richard Smith, and the fate of John Horwood was as well. Richard Smith was an influential and powerful man in Bristol. He was not only the senior surgeon at the Royal Infirmary, he was a prominent figure in civic life. He was educated, connected, and accustomed to authority. He was also, it would turn out, intensely interested in the John Horwood case in ways that went beyond his professional duties to his patient. He treated Eliza. For a time, she appeared to improve. She was making steady progress through the first week of February. But on the 10th of February, she developed a fever. Her condition deteriorated. Smith consulted colleagues and concluded that he needed to operate. He performed a procedure called trepanning. Trepanning involves cutting away a section of the skull. It is one of the oldest surgical procedures known to humanity. In 1821, it was also one of the most dangerous because the germ theory of disease did not yet exist. Surgeons operated without any understanding of infection, without sterile instruments, without any of the precautions that we now consider basic. Smith cut into Eliza's skull and, according to his own account, discovered an abscess beneath the surface which had developed from the original injury. He cleared the abscess, but 4 days later, on the 17th of February 1821, Eliza Balsum died. And here is the question that has haunted this case ever since. The trepanning procedure, carried out with unsterile instruments in a pre-antiseptic hospital, may itself have introduced the infection that caused the fatal abscess. A review of the case published in the British Medical Journal in 1869, nearly 50 years later, raised exactly this concern. It suggested that the operation, rather than the original stone, may have been the direct cause of Eliza's death. If that is correct, then the causal chain leading to the murder conviction of John Horwood is considerably less straightforward than the trial presented it to be. But in February of 1821, none of that nuance was being considered. Eliza was dead, and Dr. Richard Smith, who had treated her, who had operated on her, and who may or may not have inadvertently killed her, now gave John Horwood's name to the police. Police officers and sheriff's men went to Hanham to find John Horwood. He was charged with the willful murder of Eliza Balsum. The trial was set to take place at the Star Inn in Bedminster on the 11th of April 1821. John Horwood, in the condemned cell, had a great deal of time to sit with what he had done. The accounts that survive suggest that in this period he abandoned the bravado that had characterised his short life and returned to the chapel faith of his upbringing. He made a confession, not quite the confession you might expect, and these are reported as close to his own words as any source provides. "Lord, thou knowest that I did not mean then to take away her life, but merely to punish her, though I confess that I made up my mind, some time or other, to murder her." It is a strange and troubling statement. On the one hand, a denial of intent to kill. On the other, an admission of an intention that had existed at some point. Whether this was a genuine expression of his inner life, or the confused statement of a frightened teenager, or something shaped by whoever recorded it, we cannot know. He also wrote a poem. Before his death, it was made public after the hanging. It spoke of Eliza, of her spirit having fled, of his grief, of his guilt, of her being numbered with the dead. Whatever he was, John Horwood was not without feeling. The trial at the Star Inn in Bedminster lasted a single day. The key witness for the prosecution was Dr. Richard Smith. He testified about the injury, about his treatment, about Eliza's death, and about his conclusion that the stone thrown by John Horwood was the cause of her death. The man who had performed the operation that may have directly caused the fatal abscess was also the man testifying as an expert witness for the prosecution. There was no meaningful challenge to his evidence in this regard. The strongest argument in Horwood's defence, that the abscess might have resulted from the unclean dressings and instruments used during treatment rather than from the stone itself, was apparently never put forward at trial. Whether this was because no one thought of it, because the defence was inadequate, or because John Horwood simply did not have the resources to mount a proper case, we cannot say. The prosecution also introduced a phrenological report. Phrenology was the pseudo-scientific practice of reading a person's character from the shape of their skull. In 1821, it was taken seriously in certain quarters. The report, compiled by a woman named Mary Ann Schimmelpenninck, attempted to prove John Horwood's criminal nature through the bumps and contours of his head. It identified combativeness, self-esteem and hope as his chief mental characteristics. It also noted, with apparent regret, that the so-called bump of murder, supposedly present on the skulls of all murderers, was absent in Horwood's case. Even the pseudoscience was ambivalent about his guilt. It did not matter. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to hang, and his body, it was ordered, was to be delivered to Dr. Richard Smith of the city of Bristol, surgeon, to be dissected and anatomised. Friday, the 13th of April 1821, 3 days after John Horwood's 18th birthday, Bristol New Gaol had been built in 1820. It was a new facility, its stone still fresh. John Horwood was to be its first public execution, a grim inaugural honour. Temporary gallows had been erected above the jail's gatehouse, overlooking the New Cut, the stretch of river that ran alongside the prison walls. Thousands of people came to watch. The authorities were genuinely worried that the crush of spectators along the unfenced riverbank would result in people falling into the water. It was a significant public event. In 1821, public execution was still entertainment, still a spectacle, still a warning intended to communicate to the assembled crowd what the law would do to those who defied it. John Horwood was bound hand and foot and dropped through a trapdoor on a short rope. This was not the long drop method. The long drop method, which used the condemned person's own body weight falling through a calculated distance to break the neck and cause immediate unconsciousness, had not yet been developed. In 1821, hanging meant strangulation. Slow strangulation. It took several minutes. John Horwood, 18 years old, took several minutes to die in front of thousands of strangers. When it was over, his body was cut down and handed to Dr. Richard Smith. The dissection of John Horwood's body took place at the Bristol Royal Infirmary. It was conducted as a public lecture. Since 1752, Parliament had decreed that the bodies of executed murderers should be made available to surgeons for dissection. The reasoning was explicit. It was meant to add further terror and peculiar mark of infamy to the punishment of death by hanging. In other words, the desecration of the body after death was part of the sentence, an additional punishment, one that would have been felt deeply by John Horwood's family, who were devout chapel people, who believed, as their faith taught, in the resurrection of the body, who desperately wanted their son buried whole in the earth. Their wishes did not matter. Dr. Richard Smith stood before an audience in the infirmary and dissected the body of the boy whose death he had both contributed to and testified about. He lectured on what he found. He demonstrated his findings. And then, when the anatomical business was concluded, he did something that went beyond the letter of the law. He had John Horwood's skin removed, tanned and used to bind a book. The book that Dr. Richard Smith created from the case of John Horwood is one of the strangest objects in any British archive. It is a collection of papers relating to the case, the circumstances of Eliza's injury, the medical notes, the trial proceedings, the account of the execution, the findings from the dissection. All of it gathered together and bound between covers made from the tanned skin of John Horwood himself. The dark brown cover was embossed with skulls and crossbones. Gilt letters were added. The Latin words cutis vera Johannis Horwood, the actual skin of John Horwood. Also embossed on the cover, a gallows motif. In case the point was insufficiently clear, the practice of binding books in human skin, known by the clinical term Anthropodermic Bibliopegy, was not unheard of in the 17th and 18th centuries. It had occasionally been used as exactly this kind of post-execution mark of infamy, but that does not make it anything other than what it was, a final act of power over a body that could no longer resist anything. Smith kept John Horwood's skeleton at his home, for display. For a time, it stood in his house, a curiosity, a trophy. When Smith died, the skeleton passed to the Bristol Royal Infirmary and eventually to Bristol University, where it was kept for many years in a cupboard, with the noose still around its neck. Among the papers collected in the Horwood book or related to the case and preserved in the Bristol archives are letters from John Horwood's parents. Thomas and Phoebe Horwood. They wrote pleading for their son's body to be returned to them for burial. They wanted him in the ground whole, in the Christchurch churchyard at Hanham, as their faith required, as their grief demanded. Their letters were ignored. Their son was dissected, his skin was bound into a book, his skeleton was put on display, and his family's wishes were treated as entirely without weight. These letters survived, and nearly 200 years later they were found by a woman named Mary Halliwell. Mary Halliwell was a family genealogist. She had been tracing her family tree when she discovered that she was a descendant of one of John Horwood's brothers. She found the letters. She understood immediately what they meant. She set about locating the skeleton. She proved her family connection. She was declared the legal owner of John Horwood's remains, and on the 13th of April 2011, exactly 190 years to the hour after John Horwood was hanged, his skeleton was carried in a casket by pallbearers to a church funeral attended by 50 mourners. He was buried in the churchyard alongside his father, as his parents had asked in letters that had been waiting nearly 2 centuries to be answered. The question that the trial was supposed to settle has never entirely settled. John Horwood threw a stone at Eliza Balsum. That is not in dispute. The stone struck her on the head and caused a wound. That is not in dispute. She died 6 weeks later of a brain abscess. That is not in dispute. But whether the stone was the cause of the fatal abscess, or whether the surgery performed by Dr. Richard Smith introduced the infection that killed her, is a question that was raised as early as 1869 and has never been definitively answered. If the operation caused her death, then what John Horwood was guilty of was assault causing injury, not murder. His sentence, under any reasonable interpretation, would then have been wildly disproportionate. There is also the question of Dr. Smith's role throughout the case. He treated Eliza, he operated on her, he gave John Horwood's name to the police. He testified as the prosecution's key expert witness. He then received the body for dissection. He created the book from the skin. He kept the skeleton as a display piece. In every phase of this story, from the initial injury to the long aftermath, Richard Smith was present and central. He shaped how the case was understood and presented. And the one man who might have had reason to challenge his account, the boy on trial for his life, had neither the resources nor the legal representation to do it effectively. There is no romantic case to be made for John Horwood. He was a troubled, sometimes violent young man who threw a stone at a girl out of jealousy and rage. He had made threats against her beforehand. But between the harm he caused and the outcome he received, the machinery of the law, the medical establishment, and the culture of punishment operated in ways that were not straightforwardly just. He was 18 years old. He was hanged. He was dissected. He was bound into a book. And his parents' letters asking for his burial sat unanswered for nearly 200 years. John Horwood's story is not a glamorous one. It is a story from the bottom of society. A miner's child, a restless, difficult boy, a moment of violent jealousy by a stream, a surgical procedure in a pre-antiseptic hospital, a trial at a pub in Bedminster, a hanging above a river on a Friday morning in April, and then a long, inglorious afterlife in a cupboard at a university, with a noose around his neck. What makes it remarkable is precisely that smallness. John Horwood was not powerful. He was not connected. He had no advocate worth the name. He was entirely at the mercy of systems that had been designed by people like Dr. Richard Smith for the benefit of people like Dr. Richard Smith. And those systems consumed him completely, down to his skin. The book still exists. It is held in Bristol archives. It is too fragile now to be handled and has been digitized so that it can be seen online, a collection of papers about a dead boy, bound in the dead boy himself, embossed with skulls and crossbones, and the Latin inscription that tells you, in case you had forgotten, exactly whose skin you are holding. John Horwood was finally buried in 2011. He was finally, nearly 2 centuries late, given what his parents asked for: a grave, a churchyard, a stone in the earth of Hannam, where he was born. It is something. It is not enough, but it is something. You've been listening to the audio podcast for John Horwood, the boy who was hanged, dissected, and bound into a book. Thank you for listening. If you're fascinated by mysterious stories from history, the strange, the tragic, and the unexplained, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive, and there are many more dark chapters of history still waiting to be uncovered.